This is Francis. I'm Chairman and CEO of our investment group and your host of Washington Calling, where we interview leading voices from business and politics that impact you, the viewer. Today, we are fortunate enough to have a wonderful guest, Uday Bhaskar. Uday, thank you for coming to our show, and it's a welcome to our show. And thank you for all you do. And also, I love your columns; they're very thoughtful and wonderful, and very engaging. So, I wanted to ask you, tell us a little bit about yourself to our audience.
Well, for a start, my name is Uday Bhaskar. I'm a retired Commodore of the Indian Navy, which I think for people in the United States who may not be familiar with the rank, it's the equivalent of a one-star rank in the Navy. I think the US Navy calls it Rear Admiral Lower Half. Currently, I'm the director of the Society for Policy Studies. It's an independent think tank in New Delhi that looks at policy-related issues in the security, strategic, and foreign policy domain. Prior to that, I did about 38 years in the Indian Navy. I joined the Navy in December 1969, and I swallowed the anchor, as they would say, in early 2007. And during this period, I spent the last phase of my active service career, about 15 years, in a think tank, the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. I joined as a senior fellow, as a researcher. I spent a very long innings as the deputy director of the institute, and we had some illustrious people as heading the institute at the time, Mr. K. Subramaniam, the late civil servant who is seen as the doyen of strategic studies in India, and then Air Commodore Jasjeet Singh, who was the director after him. And for a brief period, I was also the head of the IDSA.
Wonderful.
Then I moved on to another task force that the Prime Minister had set up on the India-US relationship at that time, India and the global strategic framework. Then a brief stint as the director of the National Maritime Foundation. And now I'm here with the Society for Policy Studies.
Wonderful. So tell us what inspired you to join the Indian Navy and how do you sum up your experience? Were you able to broaden your horizon serving for the Indian Navy? And do you think experience was life-changing, challenging, but rewarding?
I would say that in my case, I grew up in India. I was born a few years after independence, and we were growing up in the late 50s, early 60s. And I think for our generation, the nation building, if I may put it in such a grand way, something that we imbibed from our elders. This was the equivalent of Nehruvian India. My father was part of the freedom struggle in his own way when he was in Pune. And I think for me personally, as a very young boy, I was fascinated by the Navy. I had a very early visit to a visiting Royal Naval ship in the eastern port of Visakhapatnam, which is called Vizag in those days. It was the HMS Belfast, I still remember. And we were taken as school kids, and we were all of 8 or 9 years old. And I think that left a certain impression on me. And then there was this whole romance of the seas. I mean, we are talking about a period when there were no computers, no cell phones, and our imaginations were unleashed through books and comics, World War II, and stories of that period. I think it was non-linear, but something there, I think, must have got embedded. And very soon, I was lucky again that where I grew up in Andhra, the government had just started Sainik schools. So at age 10, 10 and a half, I was in the Sainik school Korakonda, which incidentally was in a palace that belonged to Maharaja of Vizianagaram, the well-known cricket commentator, Vizi. So there you were, Jan 62, I was in about 65, I joined the NBA exam. And after that, of course, it was a long and very happy innings in the Indian Navy.
Let's just talk about shifting the gear towards the director of the Society for Policy Studies. The important things that I wanted you to shed some bright light about the role of the think tank and the responsibility of think tank in India. Are they effective? Do they inform, or do they also influence the policy?
Well, I would say that the role of think tank in India is evolving. and I think there are kind of two streams, if I may put it that way. India, Delhi in particular, has a certain number of think tanks, and I'm going back 20, 25 years. Initially, I would say the economic and trade related think tanks got more support and traction. And that really had to do, I think, with India and its economic and trade related objectives. Security foreign policy was a slightly more limited kind of activity. And 20, 25 years ago, there were only two shops in town, if I may put it that way. For security, we had the Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses, it's called the IDSA, supported by the Indian Ministry of Defense. And in foreign policy, we have something called the Indian Council for World Affairs, the ICWA. So in the early 90s, when I joined the think tank community, there were just two institutions of relevance. 20, 25 years later, in Delhi alone, we have more than 25 to 30 think tanks of different shape and size. And they are looking at a range of issues. Some of them are supported by the private sector. Some are supported by the armed forces, the independent Army, Navy, Air Force supported think tanks. And some, of course, are looking at economic, social, climate, energy related kind of domains. The degree to which they influence and shape public policy, I put it this way, that it's more evident in economic, trade, and financial matters.
Oh, okay.
Less evident in the security related domain. But
And what
I
about
think the ecosystem.
do they think they have the intellectual capacity and the talent to tackle the challenges that India faces in foreign policy as well as in the security issues?
Short answer is yes. I think there is a fairly rich gene pool of HR, human resource. And I think the Indian establishment, the government, because security is very much a significant kind of subject, is slowly acquiring the ability to take inputs from the outside. It's happening slowly. Some of us wish it could happen sooner, but that's India for you.
Okay. I wanted to ask you and to tell us a little bit about the India's maritime security challenges, and especially what's going on in terms of rising China, which China has already risen, and the turmoil and instability in the neighboring Pakistan. What kind of a challenges they face?
You know, India's maritime security challenges, I, as an analyst, would describe them as a spectrum of three different areas. One very broadly could be called the geostrategic and the security related part, which is where China comes into the picture. The second you might broadly classify as the geo-economic, you know, that which relates to the trade, energy, and all the other aspects that we associate with the economic aspects of a country. And the third, which I'm taking the liberty of adding, is something that could be described as the geophysical, meaning we are talking about a range of activities that relate to the human being. For instance, those who reside along the coastal parts of India. And also, by extension, I'm looking at the health of the ocean. I think today a global challenge is the way in which the oceans of the world, all three, have been polluted. Sometimes I fear beyond repair. And for India, I think this is a broad spectrum challenge. Prime Minister Modi has spent a lot of time in identifying and prioritizing the maritime domain. In 2014, when he became Prime Minister, very innovatively, he introduced a term called Sagar in relation to the Indian Ocean, which is security and growth for all in the region. And the current challenge is framed in relation to the Indo-Pacific, meaning the Indian Ocean from the east coast of Africa, right through the Arabian Sea, the Bay of Bengal, the Malaccas, and all around to the Western Pacific. And here, I think the rise of China, what China is doing in relation to the South China Sea, where it is asserting its own territorial claims in a very aggressive and assertive manner, and the way in which China is increasing its footprint in the Indian Ocean, whether it's in relation to Pakistan, it's in relation to Iran, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, now we have Djibouti, we have China in the Maldives. All of this is shrinking or reducing India's own space, politico-diplomatic space with security implications. And I think that's the challenge for India. How to manage the rise of China in the Indian neighborhood and to encourage China to comply with the rule-based order. It's very interesting.
Right.
One last point, Frank. Just yesterday in Delhi, we had our foreign minister, Mrs. Sushma Swaraj, speak at the Delhi Dialogue, which brings the India-ASEAN collective together to look at maritime security. And her opening remarks were about the need for all of us in the region to reiterate and commit ourselves to a rule-based order. And I think that is the very, very clear signal, if I may say so, to China, to America, and all the major powers about what is the most desirable orientation as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned.
Very well. I wanted to, I think you mentioned about also the instability was going on in terms of Pakistan, the rising China, and an environmental issue that you mentioned, and the pollution in the ocean. I wanted to ask you the question: what do you think is the biggest challenge, the most urgent security threat India is facing right now, besides the terrorism, secularism? I would say diversity. I would say the politicians and bureaucrats, pollutions, and I can go on. Safe water. I can go on with food security and so on and so forth. What other things do you think are the challenges they face?
Well, I would say that currently India is facing all of these challenges that you mentioned. It's only a question of how they surface and what kind of attention and what kind of capacity the state can bring to bear to deal with them. Since you mentioned terrorism, Frank, let me put it this way, that for the Indian security planner, there is one indicator, which is what happened in Mumbai in 2008 when we had the attack from Pakistan and the entire challenge of terrorism and terrorism-related security challenges. So I would say that is the most visible. It is there in the collective consciousness of India, and in a way that points to Pakistan and the internal developments in Pakistan. And it's, I think, more a coincidence that we are speaking at a period when Pakistan is in the run-up to its national election, which I think is going
next
to
week.
be
Next week. We're going to talk about that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm saying that's going to be a major challenge. Just 30 seconds, Frank. I just want to add one point here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Along with Pakistan and the terror ecosystem that we in India believe is very, very detrimental to the whole region. It's bad for Afghanistan, it's bad for India, and in a way, it's bad for Pakistan. And I think for us, the large strategic challenge is, why is China supporting such an orientation of Pakistan, which is the Pakistan military, the intelligence agencies, and the way in which they actively support terror groups and those who are, I would say, misusing religion, Islam in particular, for advancing their political objectives. That's the question mark for China. I hope people in Beijing are seeing your show, Frank. Maybe it will give them something to think about.
Oh, that's a very well articulated. I played a very important role in India-U.S. nuclear agreement, also known as 123 agreement, that was signed under when President Bush was the president and also Manmohan Singh. Do you think what have been its achievement? Have the deal achieved its stated goals?
Well, I would say yes. The India-U.S. civilian nuclear agreement that started in 2005 between then U.S. President George Bush and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was a very, very commendable political initiative on both sides. I think both President Bush and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh really put their head in the block, if you will. And we saw the success in the fall of 2008, in the last few months of Mr. George Bush's presidency and term in the White House. And I think what it did was, it was a very, very exceptional kind of political move that gave India a certain status in the global nuclear order. And the remarkable part is, the United States and India were estranged for almost 40 years over the nuclear issue. Frank, you'll remember this. You were in America for a long time. In 1974, when India carried out what we call as the peaceful nuclear explosion under Indira Gandhi, and that in turn was triggered by China's nuclear test of October 1964, the United States, for its own reasons and non-proliferation compulsions, actually introduced a legislation in 1978. It's called the NNPA, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act. And it was the first time that a democracy like India was designated by name in US law. So the remarkable part of the India-US nuclear agreement is that from that degree of estrangement, when India was placed under technological fetters and strictures and a regime, we moved from 78 to 2008, 30 years, where the same United States government and Congress supported the admission of India into the global nuclear order, even though it had not signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. I think that's a fantastic tribute to George Bush and Manmohan Singh. And 10 years later, in 2018, when we look at it, my submission as an analyst would be that the greatest takeaway is not so much the amount of uranium that India will buy from the United States or reactors, but the strategic space it has opened up for India in being able to engage in larger global issues and be on the same side as the United States in the commitment to the liberal order, democracy,
Very well said.
and everything associate with the global democratic constituency, right?
So what do you expect from the coming 2+2 dialogue? Is it being, I know it's being held in September, is it being held in Delhi or is it being held in Washington? As I understand it's being held in Delhi.
It will be held in Delhi in September. And my sense is that you're aware it had to be postponed because the US Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo, had to go to North Korea to pursue the schedule of President. But my reading is that when they meet in September in New Delhi, and this is again, I think, a very significant kind of framework where you have both the US Secretary of State and Defense meeting their Indian counterparts, that is, the Indian Minister of Defense and External Affairs, respectively. It provides, I would say, a high-level kind of political framework to review what India and the United States have committed since 2005. I think one of the most significant agreements between India and the United States is the one signed between Donald Rumsfeld and Pranab Mukherjee when he was the defense minister, going back to June 2005. It precedes the civilian nuclear agreement of July 2005 by a whole month. If India can revisit June 2005, the Rumsfeld-Mukherjee agreement, and harmonize it with the initiative made by Ashton Carter when he was the Secretary of Defense, and focus on private sector investments and whatever President Obama had done, I think it would really provide the necessary traction. But a last point, Frank, this is happening in the last lap of the Modi government, NDA2 as we call it here. And I think to that extent, it reduces the time available to the current team to really do something significant and tangible. But that is the tyranny of electoral politics, whether in the US or in India. So I think that's
that's the cost of democracy. What about the section in India that have been targeted to Iran and Russia, and India has been, and especially the oils and the Russia deal that they have with India? Do you think there will be a little bit of dialogue on that, on those two fronts?
I think so. I think the 2+2 would spend a fair amount of time trying to square the circle as far as Iran and Russia are concerned in relation to India and in relation to the United States. But correct. I am cautiously optimistic on this because after the last meeting between President Trump and President Putin, the Helsinki summit, I'm sure, Frank, you might have something to say about the Putin-Trump summit and what it's done to the domestic politics of the United States. But we are looking
that's my
a lot. But I think we are looking at it.
What is your assessment of that? The world order after the NATO and the Helsinki summit. There have been. We just passed a resolution in the Senate. That was a bipartisan resolution that the people from the United States and some of the people like Mike McFaul, Mr. McFaul, I believe he was ambassador to Russia, should not be, going there to the Russian wants some of the U.S. people to go there and also give them some kind of things, and I think that they're basically down the earth. But I have given up on President Trump in terms of his policies, his values, and his character, his conscience. And you being a distance from the United States and looking at from outside can shed some light. Where we go from here?
Well, two things I'd say, Frank. One is that it's the US people and the US electoral system that has elected Donald Trump as the US president. So as an analyst, as an Indian, I would respect that. Just as much as we expect the rest of the world to respect the choice made by the Indian people when it comes to democracy and whom we elect as our leaders. That having been said, there's a very interesting contradiction here. Immediately, I would say that if you look at 3 years or 4 years, well, not 3 years, but definitely a year and a half of President Trump, many of his policies seem to be favorable to India, meaning the manner in which, for instance, he has spoken about Pakistan, the manner in which he has drawn the line in relation to China, and the way in which he is trying to improve the US-Russia relationship. If you look at this in terms of the big picture, the statements at least of intent seem to be of a positive nature from the Indian perspective. But he has yet to deliver. Though he may have said something about Pakistan, we still do not have clarity about US policy towards South Asia. For instance, the United States is now committing to talk to the Taliban. So it's very ironic that 17 years after September 2001 and the enormity of New York and 9/11, and the US has expended so much treasure and lost so many lives, you're back to talking to the Taliban. So my question as an analyst to many US think tanks is, what was the political correlation? Where is the wisdom of Washington that you guys are doing what you are doing now? That's a question. But I think in terms of the big picture for India, we have to manage the relationship with the United States, with Moscow, with Moscow, with whom we have a very close military relationship for supplies, and with China. So any movement between any of these three players bilaterally, US-Russia, Russia-China, China-US, has a strategic implication for India. So we in India would be monitoring that very carefully. But personally, as Uday Bhaskar, if I may add, I feel a bit anguished that the United States, which is seen as the champion of democracy, you know, the one nation that is supposed to be on top of the hill and providing certain normative values which are embedded in the US Constitution and the whole US experience, including the Civil War, to where we are now, to see the way in which I would say some of these values. Let me say this upfront, Frank, you may or may not use this in your program. President Trump and gender is a cause of great anguish and sadness in India, because here you have a US president who in public has made offensive statements in relation to women. Yet he is the president of the United States. So it causes us dismay here. President Trump and the way in which he is engaging with the authoritarian regimes of the world, whether it is a China or a Russia. And where does the United States stand? Will it be purely transactional? In which case, if you accept Russia and Ukraine, Crimea, and you accept China and the South China Sea, all of us will have to go back to the drawing board, whether it's the European allies, whether it's Japan and South Korea, or people in the rest of Australasia, in Asia and Australia, saying where does the United States stand in relation to the fundamental principles that are supposed to undergird the global endeavor. We still believe in the elements of the US Constitution and the Indian Constitution. So that's my personal response to President Trump. I'm sorry, this is a longish response, but that's where
that's okay. Well, the fact of the matter is we are also puzzled, and also the fact that the democracy is descending and autocracy is ascending. So that's and we'll make the change. And I'm not here to kind of throw stones on anybody. So I want to move on to the next questions for our audience here. Talk a little bit about India's relationship with its neighbors, and especially the India-Pakistan relationship. You mentioned something about the election in Pakistan, and also what kind of lessons that India's neighbor can learn from India about the political system, the democracy, the diversity, and they kept the army out of power for a long time.
Well, I would say, I'm a little hesitant to say whether India is in a position to offer any lessons to anybody, because we have our own internal challenges. But I think the Indian experience is something that our neighbors might like to study. And again, since I was in uniform for almost 40 years, I would say that one of the characteristics of India is the commitment to civilian rule. That we have reposed our faith in the electoral system. There are many inadequacies. I'm the first person to admit that India could do better in terms of both, I think, the conduct of democracy. That democracy is more than elections. We also need to see more effective and equitable governance. I'm saying this as an Indian. But I think the plus part of the story, the more positive experience for India in 70 years is the commitment to constitution across the board, and the fact that we've had civilian rule, barring that brief period when Indira Gandhi had imposed the emergency. And let me say this as objectively as I can, that the Indian ecosystem, the way in which the institutions had evolved, whether it was parliament, the judiciary, the Indian bureaucracy, the Indian armed forces, the media, each of them has played a role. And I think we have enabled the democratic experience, and there has been no whiff, not the slightest kind of anxiety that the Indian military would in any way emulate the experience of the neighbors. Whether it's a Pakistan, whether it's a Bangladesh, whether it's a Burma, each of them in their own way have seen the shadow of the military, and they've paid a very heavy price. And I think that is the single experience, I would say, that the ecosystem of India, and in particular, the professional profile of the Indian military, the army in particular, and its apolitical nature, have enabled the robustness and sometimes, I would say, the turbulence of Indian democracy. And that's an experience I'd like to flag for the Indian military.
You're absolutely right. What are your thoughts of Prime Minister Modi's defense and security policies, and especially the foreign policy of the last 4 years? What have been the success? What have been the failure? And has he been successful in targeting the counterterrorism that you mentioned a little bit about that? And especially, he does have a great relationship with the Gulf countries, with the Asian countries that you mentioned, and also several other countries. So he has done a good job in foreign policy. The question is, has he done a good job in the defense and security policies?
Well, I'm a defense analyst.
That's my assessment.
Let me start with my own, shall we say, domain experience, if I may. I think when I look back at the last 4 years of the Modi government in relation to the defense and security domain, I would say it's been below the median. I am disappointed. And I'll tell you why. I've written about this in public to say that India's higher defense management is in need of dire, urgent structural reforms. They can only be done by the political establishment. And one indicator of my disappointment is that in 4 years, India has had 4 defense ministers, meaning that we started with Minister 1, we went to Minister 2, we went to Minister 3, and now the current incumbent, Mrs. Nirmala Sitharaman, who is a very capable minister in her own way, is number 4. So she does not have enough time to enable the Prime Minister to make those structural changes, which is a political responsibility. So I'm afraid on the big ticket issues, it has not been the success that many of us had hoped it would be. And yes, India has done a few kind of, shall we say, initiatives which are government to government, whether it's with the United States or with France or with Israel. But the real structural reforms, I'm afraid, have not been addressed. To me, that's a disappointment. And on the foreign policy front, to his credit, what Modi has done is to bring a lot of personal energy as Prime Minister. And his so-called one-on-one summit diplomacy, whether it is with President Trump, earlier it was President Obama, or with Prime Minister Abe in Japan, and various other leaders, he has brought a lot of energy, and he is visible, and therefore India is seen as having a very firm and effective leadership. But at the end of the day, it's not so much about stability. The Modi government has provided, I would say, commendable political stability in India. If you look at the numbers in the Lok Sabha, I think the challenge for Mr. Modi has been continuity. Lack of continuity in the Ministry of Defense at the level of the cabinet minister.
I wanted to close our conversation and say thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Uday, for being here, and thank you to the audience very much. And this is Frank Islam wishing you a great week.